Okay, folks, let's continue to learn a little more history. It won't be too much longer. The Palestine Mandate secured. This is a reflection of the Quran, Muslims, the Arabs, and politics in the world relative to the Jews. The Palestine and Mandate secured. 1921 to 22. June 22, Churchill explained the British position on Zionism to the Dominion Prime Ministers at a meeting of the Imperial Cabinet. Among those present were the New Zealand Prime Minister, William Massey, and the Canadian Prime Minister, Arthur Meighen. The Zionist ideal, Churchill told them, is a very great ideal. He's really supporting them, and I confess for myself it is one that claims my keen personal sympathy. But the Balfour Doctrine, he added, was more than an ideal. It was also an obligation made in wartime. Made in wartime to enlist the aid of Jews all over the world. And Britain must be very careful and punctilious, he explained, to discharge our obligations. No wonder Britain was on God's side relative to his chosen people. No wonder Britain survived in World War II. On July 5th, Dr. Weizmann, who had just returned from the United States, told Colonel Meinertzhagen that he feared for the future of Zionism. He says the British government is whittling down the Balfour Doctrine. Meinertzhagen recorded in his diary that immigration has practically stopped, see, on paper but not in reality, that the bulk of the British officers in Palestine are not in sympathy with the movement, and that the Zionists are not getting those concessions which are necessary for the establishment of the home of the Jews in Palestine. Lloyd George and Balfour both agreed that by the Balfour Doctrine they had always meant an eventual Jewish state. One of the principal Middle East advisors of the Colonial Office, Major Young, himself favored a policy which he had written to Churchill on August 1st, involved the gradual immigration of Jews into Palestine until that country becomes a predominantly Jewish state. And he went on to argue that the phrase national home, as used in the Balfour Declaration, implied no less than full statehood for the Jews of Palestine. The cabinet decided to retain the mandate, for as the official minutes recorded, stress was laid on the following consideration. The honor of the government was involved in the declaration made by Mr. Balfour, and to go back on a pledge would seriously reduce the prestige of this country in the eyes of the Jews throughout the world. So Britain, for the moment, was God's agent. Nevertheless, also contained in the cabinet's conclusion was that the warning that it was not expected that the problem could be easily or quickly solved, especially in view of the growing power of the Arabs in the territories bordering on Palestine. All of a sudden, the Arabs are starting to work together. The devil is working overtime. Churchill told the Arabs, "You are not addressing your minds to the real facts of the case." And he went on to say that he had no power or desire to repudiate the Balfour Doctrine, nor did he believe that the Jews were in any way a threat to the Arabs. "I have told you again and again that the Jews will not be allowed to come into the country except in so far as they build up the means for their livelihood according to the law. They cannot take any man's lands. They cannot dispossess any man of his rights or his property or interfere with him in any way. If they like to buy people's land and people like to sell it to them, and if they like to develop and cultivate regions now barren and make them fertile, then they have that right, and we are obliged to secure their right to come into the country and to settle." And they certainly did that despite all the odds. Do you think God was not on their side? Later on in the discussion, Churchill stated unequivocally that Britain could not grant representative government to Palestine because, as he said, "We are trustees not only for the interests of the Arabs but also for the interests of the Jews. We have a double duty to discharge. The Arabs could not have a representative government," he said, "because that would be giving them the power to halt Jewish immigration. The British government," he added, "wants to see Jews developing and fertilizing the country and increasing the population of Palestine. It was of great pity," he continued, "that there were so few people in Palestine, which had been once 3 or 4 times more populous. He wanted to see more wealth in Palestine instead of it being occupied by a few people who were not making any great use of it. It was Britain's intention, and Churchill had declared, to bring more Jews in. We do not intend you to be allowed to stop more from coming in. You must look at the facts, like they're going to be convinced. During his final speech, Churchill, declared, the Jews are a very numerous people, and they are scattered all over the world. This is a country where they have great historic traditions, and you cannot brush that aside as though it were absolutely nothing. They were there many hundreds of years ago, and they have always tried to be there. They have done a great deal for the country, and they have started many thriving colonies, and many of them wish to go there and live there. It is to them a sacred place. Many of them go there to be buried in the city which they regard as sacred, as you regard it as sacred. Why cannot you live together in amity and develop their country peacefully? There is room for all as long as they are not brought on in great numbers, before they are a means of livelihood for them. Before the electrical and other means of power are created which will make waste places fertile, before the hills have had terraces made upon them, before irrigation and proper agricultural development. Of course, if they were brought in before these things were done, you would have reason to complain. The Jews have a far more difficult task than you. Yeah, and they super results too, under all odds. You only have to enjoy your own possession, but they have to try to create out of the wilderness, out of the barren places, a livelihood for the people they bring in. They have to bring them in under conditions which make for the general good of the population, and which supplant no one and deprive no one of their rights and liberties. A grand scheme, and God's chosen instrument, Churchill. The Rutenberg scheme. Before the mandate was itself finalized, the British government made a major contribution to the development of the Jewish national home. This took the form of granting the Zionists a monopoly control of the development of the electrical resources of Palestine, according to a scheme which had been drawn up by the Russian-born Jewish engineer Pinchas Rutenberg to harness the waters of Palestine. The Rutenberg scheme was accepted by the British government as an integral part of its mandate commitment to the Jews. On May 24th, John Shuckburgh sent Churchill the final draft of Sir Herbert Samuel's memorandum on the future of Palestine. In it, Samuel described as impracticable Weizmann's much-quoted remark of 1919 that Palestine would become as Jewish as England is English. The British government, Samuel insisted, had no such aim in view, nor did they wish to see the disappearance of the subordination of the Arab population, language, or culture in Palestine. Samuel also stressed that the Balfour Doctrine did not contemplate that Palestine as a whole should be converted into a Jewish national home, but that such a home should be founded in Palestine. Samuel's memorandum went on to state once again that further Jewish immigration could not be permitted to exceed whatever may be the economic capacity of the country at any given time to absorb new arrivals. Of course, people are going to see to the fact that it doesn't grow, but notwithstanding, it did grow. Because who's behind it? The Palestine White Paper. Samuel's statement was accepted by the Colonial Office as a guideline for future British policy and was published as part of the Palestine White Paper June 30th, 1922. The Zionists themselves formally accepted the White Paper, but they were unhappy about fixing so specific an economic condition on future immigration, fearing that any unsympathetic and even anti-Zionist high commissioners in the future would abuse the concept of an economic absorptive capacity in order to halt future investigation. In other words, they were going to make short shrift of any attempt to develop the area. But God had a different idea. Churchill's defense in the House of Commons overwhelmingly approves of the Palestine mandate. Churchill spoke in defense of the Zionists July 4th, telling the House of Commons anyone who has visited Palestine recently must have seen how parts of the desert have been converted into gardens and how material improvement has been effected in every respect by the Arab population dwelling around. On the sides of the hills there are enormous systems of terraces, and they are now the abode of an active cultivating population, whereas before, under centuries of Turkish and Arab rule, they had relapsed into a wilderness. There is no doubt whatever that in that country there is room for still further energy and development if capital and other forces be allowed to play their part. There is no doubt that there is room for a far larger number of people, and this far larger number of people will be able to lead far more decent and prosperous lives. Apart from this agricultural work, this reclamation work, there are services which science, assisted and by outside capital, can render, and all the enterprises of importance which would have the effect of greatly enriching the land. None was greater than the scientific storage and regulation of the waters of the Jordan for the provision of cheap power and light needed for the industry of Palestine, as well as water for the irrigation of new lands now desolate. The granting of the Rutenberg concession did not involve, Churchill said, injustice to a single individual. It did not take away one scrap of what was there before, and it offered to all the inhabitants of Palestine the assurance of greater prosperity and the means of a higher economic and social life. Considering the outlying Arab nations, this was a gold mine for Arabs to participate in. Critics of the Rutenberg concession had insisted that it was far for the Arab majority to develop the economic wealth of Palestine. Churchill sought to rebut this argument. He said, "I am told that the Arabs would have done it themselves." Who is going to believe that? Left to themselves, the Arabs of Palestine would not in 1,000 years have taken effective steps towards the irrigation and electrification of Palestine. They would have been quite content to dwell, a handful of philosophic people, in the waste sun-scorched plains, letting the waters of the Jordan continue to flow unbridled and unharnessed into the Dead Sea. The House divided at the end of Churchill's speech. His appeal was successful. Only 35 votes were cast against the government's Palestine policy and 292 in favor. Hence, we have the League of Nations approves the Palestine Mandate. The success of the Rutenberg debate effectively freed the Colonial Office from the pressure of the anti-Zionists and left the way clear for presenting the final terms of the mandate to the League of Nations. July 22nd, the League of Nations approved the Palestine Mandate. Henceforth, the anti-Zionists strongly expressed their criticisms and could not uproot the Jewish national home. They tried, but they couldn't. It's so much in the favor. Let the Israelites in, and look how much prosperity everybody will share in. Persecutions and riots and refugees, nevertheless. The granting of the Palestine Mandate to Britain provided a major stimulus to Zionist enterprise and development. But it neither lessened Arab opposition to Zionism nor improved the lot of Jews elsewhere. Even Jewish settlement in Palestine was subject to increasing difficulties, both economic and political. Palestinian Arab Congress, 6 October 1924. The daily slight frictions between Arab and Jew, whose ideas, principles, customs, and modes of life take dramatically divergent lines, cultivate and solidify hatred between both communities, and there must be a time when it will accumulate to such a degree as to defy all moral or political restraints. Wave all this prosperity, and there was, and there's just hatred, despite the fact that they could prosper along with the Jews. It is a gross error to believe that Arab and Jew may come to an understanding if only each of them exchanges his code of extremism for another of moderation. When the principles underlying two movements do clash, it is future to expect their meeting halfway. Both Leopold Amory, then Colonial Secretary, and Winston Churchill, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, supported the proposed Zionist loan for the sole purpose of promoting and expediting close settlement by Jews on the land. But the Cabinet rejected it, and in doing so marked a step away from what had earlier been regarded as one of Britain's obligations under the national home provisions of the mandate. Arab attacks on Jews spread throughout Palestine. When the attacks ended at nightfall on August 29th, 133 Jews had been killed. 87 Arabs had also died, mostly shot by British troops and police seeking to halt the violence. 2 weeks later, on September 29th, the new British High Commissioner of British troops in Palestine, Sir John Chancellor, telegraphed to the Colonial Office, "The latent, deep-seated hatred of the Arabs for the Jews has now come to the surface in all parts of the country. Threats of renewed attacks upon the Jews are being freely made and are only being prevented by visible presence of considerable military force." So in view of the telegraph, the latent, deep-seated hatred for the Arabs for the Jew has now come to the surface in all parts of the country. Threats of renewed attacks upon the Jews are being freely made and are only being prevented from visible presence of considerable military force. That same day, September 29th, the president of the Arab executive in Palestine, Musa Qasim Pasha warned a senior British official in Palestine that unless the Jewish national home policy was changed, there would be an armed uprising.